Hello, and welcome. I'm Johnny Boy, and if you're like me, you love playing MMOs. I've played several over the years, such as EVE Online, Atlas, and most recently, the subjects of this video, The Elder Scrolls Online and Final Fantasy XIV. I've played both of these games for several hundred hours, and I figured I'd collect and share my thoughts on them. This video's a mixture of overview, review, and comparison between the two games, and it's honestly ballooned quite a bit from my first ideas of what this video would look like. To make it easier to navigate, I've sectioned this video into 11 categories, which I feel cover the most important parts of both games. If you're only interested in one or two parts, feel free to skip around and watch what you want. I've done my best to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible. I usually only talk in generalities about design philosophies or choices the devs have made instead of specific things. It'll depend on your personal definition of a spoiler, I suppose, as I have to reference things that happen past the title screens, but I doubt your play experience will be ruined by anything in this video. Whether you're here to learn about one game, or both, or you're just here to see if your opinions match up with mine, I hope that you find what you're looking for in this video. Let's get started with the first part, characters and classes.
This is the first thing I want to see first. How do you do the boob slider? All right.
There's more to character customization in an MMO than just a character creator, but that is the most logical place to start. That said, I honestly don't have too much to say about the character creators in both games. They both exist and have enough features to allow you to express all but the most outlandish or unique character ideas you may have. But I've never been one for taking ages to create my character, get every little thing right. So I don't have too much else to say here. There is another relevant thing, but we will circle back to that in a little bit. Let's talk about the classes now, or as they're also called in Final Fantasy XIV, jobs. Final Fantasy has 18 combat classes to choose from, 4 tanks, 3 healers, and 11 DPS. With this many classes to choose from, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they all blend together into an unrecognizable mush, but you'd be wrong. Each of the classes may have the same ultimate goals as the rest of the classes in their role, but they play in unique ways, thanks to the unique mechanics that each of them has. Some are less intensive than others, but each class has at least one unique mechanic, in addition to a new set of spells, keeping it fresh and distinct from the other classes in its role. The best part of all of this is that each of these 18 classes can be played on a single character and swapped between at will. Your starting class doesn't lock you into a class, or even a role, and once you meet the minimum level and story progression requirements, you can pick up any class you want, try it out, and if you don't like it, swap right back to what you do. It's good that swapping is so easy, as the customizability of classes is almost non-existent. You don't even get to pick skills on level up. They're handed out at pre-designated levels. In ESO, there's only 6 classes, but that low number is a little deceptive. The customization of classes in ESO doesn't come entirely from the classes themselves. While classes have 18 unique skills each, guilds, armor, weapon, world, and other skill trees will make up a significant part of every build's skill selections. Each of these skills has 2 morph choices, each for additional customization based on what you want. What's more, classes aren't earmarked for DPS, healer, or tank in character creation. What puts a class into a role is the weapon, armor, skills, and attributes it has, not the class itself. Though some classes are better at certain roles than others. Some of the defining skills for tanks, healers, and DPS are from the equipment and guild skill lines, rather than locked to individual classes. This means that you're theoretically free to switch up whatever role you want to play by simply changing gear, swapping equipped skills, and respeccing attributes, a process which can take less than a minute. This means that my DPS main, a Magicka Sorcerer, can put on some tank gear, equip a taunt, defensive, and buff abilities, respec attributes and champion points, and be ready to roll as a fully fledged tank. There is one problem. My Magicka Sorcerer is a high elf, and high elf racial passives just aren't conducive to tanking. And we've come full circle. Character creation, specifically race selection, and ESO has just about as much of a say in what role a character is best with, as what class they are, strangely. Thanks to the racial passives ESO has, certain races are better at certain roles. My High Elf is best at the Magicka DPS role. My Red Guard, well suited for Stamina DPS, and my Argonian is one of the races which is good at tanking. The racial passives don't make a huge difference, but if you're like me, the loss of optimization is something that I really find annoying, and it's why I've matched my characters' races with the roles I want them to play. Not so with Final Fantasy, actually. There's no racial passives to worry about, and all characters are on the same equal footing regardless of their race. It can lead to some funny or immersion-breaking moments, where a tiny little Lalafell is tanking gargantuan bosses just as well as a Rogadin could. It's nice not to have to worry about a choice you make early on biting you in the ass later. In sum, ESO's characters and classes are more geared toward a min-maxer's approach, where the choices you make have a noticeable effect on your performance. In Final Fantasy, allows you to pursue the aesthetic look and class you want, without the fear of making the wrong choice.
Tell me, for whom do you fight?
Final Fantasy and ESO also take very different approaches to how they include and handle story-focused content. It's probably best to think of Final Fantasy as a story, with a game constructed around it, and ESO as a game with a story component. That may sound confusing, so let me explain, starting with Final Fantasy. You start the game in one of 3 cities, and are directed to follow the main story quests nearly immediately. There's even a banner showing you the location and title of the current quest. Neat. You continue through the story and eventually get to the first dungeon you unlock, completion of which is required for story progression. The MSQ, as it's called, will give you enough XP completing it to level with its level requirements, meaning you can get to max level on one job by doing nothing else. A couple quests later, you'll reach the first trial, and eventually you'll come across quests with blue backgrounds. These usually unlock new content and have stories of their own to follow. But here's where you may get a little irritated. Your friends have told you about a cool area in an expansion zone, and you'd really like to visit it, just to look at it, even if you're still in the early parts of the Realm Reborn's questline. Sorry, those zones are locked until you progress the main story to that expansion. You'll need to follow other stories to unlock the game's content as well. Alliance and Light Party raids, trials, and to a lesser extent dungeons and gameplay features are locked behind what I'm going to call story walls. You're required to follow quest lines to unlock content, which does add some great flavor to the encounters, but if you don't care about the story, you're going to be stuck impotently yelling that you don't care as a cutscene transitions into yet another text wall, instead of the raid unlock you're there for. Essentially, everything in Final Fantasy XIV is gated by these story walls. Don't expect to be let into a raid without the proper information to contextualize the encounter. All of this said, if you do care about the story, you're in for a fucking treat. Final Fantasy XIV has some of the best story content I've ever had the pleasure of playing, viewing, and reading. The main story itself took me about 400 hours or so to complete from A Realm Reborn to the end of Shadowbringers. A lot of those hours were in-engine story cutscenes, which are really good. It did have some lulls, to be fair, but the narrative which the writers tell over those hours is one I will not forget anytime soon. The main story is well worth the time investment and is the crux of the world building and what the rest of the game is built on. You'll grow to love the characters you meet, even witness their growth, and even have a little of your own. You will understand, respect, or even care for the villains, and you'll understand why they're doing what they're doing. You'll feel very immersed in the world as a whole. The story has emotional ups and downs, and you will feel them. I'm not going to be any more specific than this. I'm just going to say that you will not regret your time spent playing the MSQ. There's a good chance, if you've heard of Final Fantasy XIV, that you've seen or at least heard of the positive reactions former WoW streamers, personalities, and even players have been having to the main story specifically, and I will tell you that those opinions, while they may be a little played up for dramatic effect, are at their roots genuine. It's a truly amazing main story. The other important stories in the game, such as job quests and raid quests, develop the backstory of the world, large figures within it, and how the various jobs all play a part in that world. They're all pretty good, but some of them don't have the same time to get you invested as the main story does. There is also a New Game Plus feature, so people who skip the story or just want to revisit it can go back and do so. ESO takes a different approach. As I said before, it's more of a game with a story built around it, and that's true. ESO does have a main story, but it's short, and none of it's really required. You have the freedom to pursue almost anything you like, without the story gating, meaning you can go at the dungeons and trials without lengthy quest lines beforehand. Instead, the stories told by this content are inside of the content itself. You can pick up quests at the start of an encounter and complete them by completing the content. They also give skill points for completion, meaning that there is a useful reward for following these stories. However, they don't give you that much in the way of experience, especially with, zone quests and all that. There are faster ways to level than questing. Most of the story in ESO is found outside of the main quest and instance content. If you've played Skyrim, you'll find the experience very familiar. There's zones with main quest lines and some familiar guilds with their own stories, in addition to the random side quests that you'd expect from an Elder Scrolls game. Some of these stories can be quite good, but most of them individually didn't really last long enough to get me fully invested in them. There is a metric ton of this story content though. Each of the game's almost 40 zones has its own main quest line, in addition to the side quests strewn about the world for extra content. One thing I really appreciate is that these quests are all fully voiced by high quality voice actors, some of whom you may even recognize.
This was a message from my brother, one I wasn't meant to survive. I feared this day would come.
Final Fantasy XIV does have a phenomenal story, but for some people it may be harder to get into, just because of how much of it is text-based and reading reliant. Overall, the stories in ESO and Final Fantasy are reflective of their different design philosophies. One which heavily features and integrates stories into literally everything, and the other which includes story content for players who desire to experience it. Character progression is my catch-all term for the leveling, gearing, and daily grinds of ESO and Final Fantasy. The first part of the character progression journey in both games is the leveling process, so let's start there. As mentioned previously, in Final Fantasy the main story is a significant source of experience, and is more than enough to level a single job from 1 to max. If you add in some additional sources of experience, you can share the story XP between multiple jobs and get a couple extra to max as well. Speaking of those additional sources, most activities in Final Fantasy will give you amounts of experience, but what you're going to be doing most of the time is running dungeons, daily roulettes, and doing fates. Dungeons can give you good amounts of experience, and fates are quick, but the daily roulettes are a very time-efficient way to get experience. These roulettes throw you into random content, depending on the category of roulette you choose. It's a neat way to ensure that older content is still populated for new players progressing through it for the first time, and that queue times for it are short, and it is fun to get placed back into content that you may not have seen in a while. Anyways, while I say it gives good amounts of XP, that is just relative to the other sources. The leveling process in Final Fantasy is incredibly slow. It's going to take multiple days to a week to level a job from 1 to 80, unless you pay. Depending on how hard you min-max, of course. Thankfully, the newer jobs start at 30, 50, and 60, depending on which expansion they were released in, but getting all 18 to max is still a daunting task. Leveling the crafter and gatherer jobs can be much less time intensive, but it still can be a little intimidating. In ESO, it's a little strange. The leveling process is simultaneously much quicker and also practically unending. I'll explain. In ESO, a character's level is broken down into 2 parts: its actual level and a post-level cap power number called champion points. The actual leveling part from level 1 to 50 is the quickest part by far, and can be done in a number of ways. Among the fastest, which can be done by anyone, is just running around doing dolmens in the Alakir Desert. There's almost always a train running, you join it, and get experience for doing pretty much nothing, just following the crowd. It's pretty mind-numbing, but it does level your character up in a dozen or so hours, depending on if there's a double XP event running, and the type of XP buffs that you are using. You can also pay people to carry you through certain instances of content, which can reward ridiculous amounts of experience, like Skyreach Catacombs or BRP. It's expensive, but it can level a character from 1 to 50 very quickly, like in a couple of hours. There's a lot of ways to level up an ESO character quickly, but I hope I've made my point. The grind to max is much faster than in Final Fantasy. The champion point grind, however, isn't so quick. After reaching level 50 for the first time, your character gains a new level tracker, champion points, which are capped at 3,600. These champion points can be spent on minor bonuses to character power, such as run speed, a % damage done from the back, or like a decrease in stamina cost when you're blocking. They're not massive buffs, but they are definitely noticeable. The true max level point, I feel, comes at CP 160, which is the highest level gear and items can drop at. They scale prior to this to your level, meaning it's worthless to collect gear before CP 160, as better versions of it will drop when you level up. These champion points are shared across all characters on an account, meaning that a fresh character hitting level 50 will be rocketed up to the highest champion point level achieved. Champion point levels increase exponentially in the number of XP required to achieve them, and reaching 3,600, while possible, is incredibly rare. The amount of XP needed to reach 600 CP, which is where most of a character's power is available, is 25% of the XP needed to hit 1200, and a minuscule 2% of the XP needed to reach 3600. Considering how, after about 700 hours of playtime, I'm only at the mid-700s, the path to 3600 seems essentially unending. Far better to take a break along the way and gear out my characters. The gearing process in ESO can be both awful and amazing, depending on how much you get screwed by RNG. Some decent sets of gear can be crafted or purchased from other players, but the vast majority of high-end gear will be dropped from world bosses, dungeons, trials, solo instances, and random chests. Bosses will drop gear from an instance or zone's loot table directly to each player, with certain items dropping more rarely than others. Items could be traded between party members for up to 2 hours, but that is assuming that the gear pieces you need dropped it all when you ran the content. Considering that you need 2 5-piece gear sets, in addition to either an antiquity piece or a monster set, you're looking at a significant time sink if the dice rolls and drops just aren't in your favor. This can leave you needing to run a specific piece of content over, and over, and over, because the specific weapon you need to complete a set just isn't dropping. Looking at you, Burning Spellweave Inferno Staff. Monster sets are a sort of hybrid on this. The helms are guaranteed to drop from the veteran dungeons, though it is another random chance between light, medium, and heavy weights. And the shoulder pieces are in little loot boxes that have a 1 in 6 chance of dropping what you want. More on these later. While actually getting gear can be a pain in the ass, the design philosophy behind how ESO treats gear and its power redeems it quite nicely. Gear sets in ESO don't just increase stats, they also offer set bonuses depending on how many pieces you have equipped. These bonuses will be the reasons behind why a particular set is used for a role. These bonuses are especially important for tanks and healers, as the sets they wear are almost always focused on granting buffs to their groups. Some DPS sets offer raid-wide buffs as well, but these are rare. Typically, joining a high-end raid group will be gated behind a DPS's ability to do damage, rather than what specific gear sets they're using to do so. Gear does stop scaling in power at CP 160, and this ceiling doesn't increase with new expansions, meaning that the gear from new dungeons and raids, introduced in the latest expansion, isn't necessarily better than older gear, just because it's newer, and therefore meant for higher level players. This means that players have the option to pick whatever gear sets they want based on their set bonus, rather than by being pushed into comparing gear based on an arbitrary item level number. While newer sets are often really good, Returning players, which had finished the gearing process about 2 years ago, won't be compelled to restart the grind, just because best in slot gear now has a higher item level. All of this results in ESO having great diversity in viable builds. Some sets are better than others, of course, but I'm free to mix and match whichever sets I feel are best in a situation. And I'll still perform comparably to another party member, even if they have a completely different set of gear. I gotta say, I really love this. Final Fantasy flips it entirely. Gear is much less based on RNG, and it is also much less interesting. In Final Fantasy, you're on a gear treadmill, which starts each time a new major patch releases. There's a new set of gear you're intended to collect each time a new raid tier releases, because its item level is X higher than the old raid tier's gear. And that old gear, I'm sorry, it's out of date now. Each patch will have several tiers of max level gear, obtained from sources like crafting, normal raids, or dungeons, with upgraded tombstone gear, savage raid gear, and relic weapons typically being your best in slot. Upgraded tombstone gear and relic weapons can be obtained with a metric fuck-ton of non-RNG grinding, but the trade-off is that you aren't required to set foot in the game's hardest and newest content. If you're looking for more challenge, savage raids will drop chests of gear on completion for party members to roll for, in addition to tokens, which can be exchanged for gear pieces. You can attach materia to gear to customize its stats a little bit, but that's the extent of any nuance the system had. Aside from that, it's just bigger number means better, and all newer numbers are necessarily bigger. Add that to the need to grind a new gear set for each job category. Some jobs do share gear, and you're looking at a monstrous grind if you want to get best in slot for each job you have at max level. And you have to do this each time a new gear tier unlocks. Speaking of grinds, let's conclude the character progression section by talking about the daily grind requirements of each game. Coming hot off the heels of me complaining about Final Fantasy's grind, you may be surprised to hear that the game doesn't really have much in the way of artificial hooks to incentivize you to log in each day. There's no consecutive daily login rewards that you'll feel bad if you're missing, no daily quests that character progression is gated behind. There's basically no daily chores that you have to do each time you log in. There's the daily roulettes, sure, but the XP and other rewards you receive from doing those can be obtained from a couple other sources as well. You're not penalized for taking a break. Final Fantasy actually caps the amount of high-tier tombstones and loot you can earn each week, which is bizarre to me, as you'd think MMO devs would be invested in trapping their players. Apparently not, and I appreciate that they've chosen to go with that design philosophy. On the other hand, ESO's daily activities are much more involved. There's the daily login rewards, which increase the player's rewards the more days in a month players log in, the daily dungeons and battlegrounds, and the undaunted quests. The daily login rewards don't give anything critical, but the daily dungeons and battlegrounds and the undaunted quests are integral to endgame gear progression. Gear in ESO drops with random traits. To change the trait to what's desired, which is vital for damage per second or survivability, etc., you need to spend 50 transmutation crystals. There are technically other sources for these, but the main source of transmute crystals will be the daily dungeon and battlegrounds, but you get 10 crystals per daily you complete. If you're observant, you'll notice that these numbers don't really match up. You've either got to do multiple days worth of dailies or run them on multiple characters each day. Transmuting an entire set of gear in a timely manner will require both, honestly. The requirement to run these dailies can drag after a while, especially when paired with undaunted quests. Daily dungeon quests which players run to earn the loot boxes, with the 1 in 6 drop rate that I mentioned earlier. If you're out of things to do in ESO, these dailies can definitely occupy your time. But if you've got something you do want to do, the pressure on you to run these every single day can begin to drag. This section's been long as shit, I know, don't worry, it's over. Let's talk about controls in combat for a bit. I'll give an overview of the general differences, and then my opinions on how each role feels to play. I'll talk about encounter design, philosophies, and similar things in the next section, rather than here. If you play both games, the first thing that you're going to notice is how much faster the combat feels in ESO. And that's due to a much faster global cooldown on ESO spells, 1 second versus around 2.5 with Final Fantasy, though it isn't locked to that 2.5 and can vary with equipment and per spell. Final Fantasy's combat classes also have off-global cooldown spells and abilities, which you can weave between GCD casts to keep your fingers busy. But on classes with lower numbers of these abilities, you're going to be sitting around and waiting for the GCD for a good chunk of combat time. ESO also has off-GCD inputs, as characters are allowed to weave in weapon attacks by animation canceling a spell cast. A player's proficiency in LA weaving, as it's called, has a significant impact on their overall damage output. This LA weaving also essentially doubles the amount of average key presses per second, doubling the pace of combat. DPS rotations can be very intensive because of this. To go with a faster pace, ESO characters are also very much more responsive. ESO employs a traditional action camera, where the player's point of view is directly linked to mouse movement. Target selection is dependent on which entity is currently being aimed at by the mouse. It's good for quick target swapping, but picking out a preferred target from a pack of them can be a pain. ESO also feels quicker because of the roll and sprint mechanics. These are tied to keyboard shortcuts and allow the player a good degree of additional control. Rolls also grant short invulnerability windows, and timing them correctly can allow a player to avoid damage. Final Fantasy's controls similarly reflect its slower pace. For example, Sprint is a timed ability with a cooldown, rather than a toggleable on-demand ability. Many classes have additional movement abilities, such as the Black Mage's Teleport, but they're typically on pretty long cooldowns and used more as just straight movement abilities, or as part of a damage rotation. Final Fantasy's camera controls and targeting are one of the biggest downsides of the game to me. I really dislike tab targeting, and both of the camera control options just feel janky and terrible. Let's get a little more specific now. Both games have the DPS tank and healer roles. I mainly play DPS classes, but I do play tanks and healers as well, enough to feel relatively confident in giving my opinion. If you're a DPS player as well, you'd be interested to know that DPS classes in both games have essentially the same priorities and tools. Priorities for DPS in both games are, in order, 1. Stay alive, 2. Resolve mechanics if it's your job to, 3. Buff the group if you can, and 4. Go through your DPS rotation. Obviously, there's differences in the abilities used to stay alive, and differences in encounter mechanics between games, which I will talk about in the content section, and differences in how damage is done, but essentially a DPS's job is identical in both games. Staying alive is somewhat more important in Final Fantasy, as while people can be revived in the middle of combat, they will take temporary 25% and 50% debuffs to damage stats, depending on how many times you have been revived. Another notable difference is that ESO doesn't lock revives to healers only. In rough situations, DPS can and should take on that responsibility as well. ESO's rotations are also interruptible, and there's no long combos to worry about resolving like there are in Final Fantasy. Both games do have proc abilities as well, things like that. Aside from mechanics layered on top, though, DPS players are treated essentially identically. The healer role is slightly more differentiated, but playing healers feels pretty similar in both games. Priorities again, 1. Stay alive, 2. Resolve mechanics, 3. Keep others alive, 4. Buff the group, and 5. Do DPS. While these priorities are essentially identical, the amount of time needed to deal with them isn't. Final Fantasy gives healers an ever-expanding arsenal of tools with which to maintain party health, both on the global cooldown and off of it. Healers can stack several regen or shield effects directly onto party members in lieu of reactively healing after damage has been done, meaning that they have much more time to cast global cooldown, damage, and buff abilities. While doing damage is still a low priority, damage over time and off global cooldown heals and shields will allow healers to buff and do damage on the global cooldown without worrying too much about reacting to damage. In ESO, these DOT heals do exist, but a bigger portion of these effects are ground AoEs. In more mobile fights, a greater portion of time is going to be devoted towards recasting these abilities over and over as the fight and the group moves. After these ground AoEs are recast, healers can resume progressing through the priority list. Damage is also usually less telegraphed in ESO, and healers need to either have these AoEs placed or be ready for casts of burst heals to keep groups alive. Players can die incredibly quickly in harder content if healers aren't ready. In general, ESO healers will spend less time in the damage phase of our priority rotation than they would in comparable content in Final Fantasy. While DPSing and healing are very similar in both games, tanking is handled quite differently. Tanks in Final Fantasy are very similar to DPS. Aggro is maintained by doing damage to targets, and tanks are given damage rotations and other tools in order to do that. They have different priorities, sure, as tanks are expected to always maintain the boss's aggro, turn them away, etc., but playing a tank doesn't feel much different than playing a DPS. Surviving a tank buster is as simple, quote-unquote, as casting a damage reduction skill, or using a class-specific invincibility button, which each tank class has. Once that skill's cast, all a tank has to do is follow the DPS priority list. It just doesn't feel unique, I'm sorry to say. I've had a blast playing the DPS and healing jobs in Final Fantasy, but I haven't really enjoyed playing tanks too much. ESO's tanks, on the other hand, are more or less incapable of doing much damage to enemies. Taunts are maintained through direct casts of skills on single targets. Damage mitigation is much more active. Blocking with a shield reduces incoming damage significantly, and that is the main source of survival for a tank. Surviving tank busters is predicated on blocking first and resistances from gear and skills second. Tank gear as well doesn't increase personal damage. It can usually buff the party's damage output. Tanks will never typically be doing more than 1 to 2k DPS, or maybe a little bit more, but it's a side effect from AoEs put down to debuff a boss, or things like that. The majority of a tank's time will be devoted to casting buff skills, shields, or self-heals, to blocking, or to bashing targets to interrupt skill casts, rather than to doing damage. I love tanking in ESO. It's so different from the other roles, and the challenge of surviving while maintaining group buffs and other uptimes keeps you on your toes, especially in harder content. Another thing that does need mentioning is the AoE taunt situation. Final Fantasy's tanks can, and ESO's tanks cannot. It's beyond ironic that the game, which throws massive waves of enemies at parties, doesn't give tanks the tools they need to aggro them all, and the game, which limits its mobs in number to like 5 per pull, does. My tank is overprepared for the fight you're watching right now, so I'm not much in danger of really dying here, but it's a nightmare trying to maintain aggro on all these freaking Daedroth, as well as the boss, who keeps teleporting. Large pulls of a massive number of mobs can leave you kinda just casting a single root skill, throwing up your hands, and praying your DPS have AoE ults ready, cause there's no fucking way you can taunt all of those mobs. Adding an AoE taunt ability would be quite a quality of life improvement for ESO. Stepping down off my soapbox, I hope this has given you a decent overview of the differences in general combat mechanics. In a vacuum, I have to say that ESO's combat mechanics are better here. There's more diversity between roles, and playing them is much more engaging by themselves than in Final Fantasy. But next up, we will discuss the content that these mechanics are built for. Dungeons, trials, raids, world bosses. These are the real meat of an MMO. You can't really have one without these. In this section, I'm going to give an overview of the content available to play, some observations I have on mechanics, and some opinions from my time playing. I'm saving discussions on the more visual and auditory aspects of this content for the next section. ESO has a lot of content for players to take part in, split between encounters in the world and instance dungeons and trials. First off, every zone in the game has several world bosses and delves, which are sort of mini dungeons, and a public dungeon for players to clear. The amount of world content does vary by zone, but there's enough of it to satiate your desire for PvE for several hundred hours. ESO also has 46 instance dungeons, each of which has a normal and a veteran harder version. ESO's base game dungeons are typically much easier than their DLC counterparts, with some veteran base game dungeons being easier than the normal versions of DLC dungeons. ESO also has 10-12 person trials, with the same difficulty options and the same DLC difficulty bump. These trials are large raids, which usually tie into a zone's story and setting. Both veteran dungeons and trials have hard mode options for the final boss, which increases its health and usually either adds a new mechanic or enhances previous ones. It's a nice bit of added challenge, and certain quests, like the Undaunted dailies I mentioned previously, give extra rewards for completing fights in hard mode. Mechanics in these trials and dungeons are usually relatively simple conceptually, in the form of AoEs to bring in or out of a group or dodge, objects or AoEs in the environments to interact with, things like that. Some instances like Cloud Rest can throw a couple challenging mechanics at players simultaneously, but in general, resolving these mechanics isn't really predicated too heavily on all 12 players being in sync with each other. This approach is very suited for ESO's combat mechanics. Players will be able to make use of sprint and dodge rolls to avoid AoEs. The invuln period after a roll is actually quite long and very appreciated. When bosses aren't throwing mechanics at players, which is often, much of the fun of combat comes from players and their own priority rotations. As mentioned previously, DPS rotations are very intensive, and eking out maximum uptime on damage over time abilities and buffs, weaving as solidly as possible, etc., can be a challenge on its own. And when paired with the unique mechanics to an encounter, it really makes for an action-packed and fun experience, without usually being overwhelming. It's just the right amount of things you have to think about. ESO's content doesn't overwhelm players, it challenges them. And there's always more challenges to think about as well. The highest peak of endgame is the chasing of achievements in veteran content, like no death, speedruns, and hard mode, or all three, the so-called trifecta. Final Fantasy XIV has a gargantuan amount of instance content, but it's sadly lacking in engaging world content. I'm going to be honest, fates aren't fun at all. Final Fantasy's instance content, however, can be classified into 4 major groups. 4-person dungeons, 8-man trials, which are basically just boss fights, 8-man normal raids, which are similar to trials, and 24-player alliance raids, which have 4 or more bosses and are kind of similar to trials in ESO. There are 60 normal and 16 hard dungeons, changed versions of normal dungeons, best understood as like a dungeon 2, 38 normal trials and 31 extreme trials, 12 alliance raids, and 48 normal raids, which come with 48 savage trials. This doesn't even include the 3 ultimates or the Unreal trials. That is an absurd amount of instance content to chew through. Of course, with all this content, certain mechanics are bound to repeat themselves, and they do quite frequently, but by design. Encounters in Final Fantasy are very, very mechanics heavy, and players will have no option but to resolve these mechanics, especially in harder content. Players starting in A Realm Reborn and completing content on their way to the end of Shadowbringers will be building a mental library of mechanics which are common to many bosses. This doesn't mean that these mechanics get tired or even predictable. In fact, most encounters, even lowly mid-dungeon bosses, will have unique mechanics which are not reused elsewhere, keeping it from devolving into just another tank and spank. An encounter may reuse multiple common mechanics like stacks, splits, or gaze effects, but immediately follow it up with a mechanic which is completely unique to that one specific fight. Players in normal content will usually be able to struggle through without any preparation, but the completion of harder content, especially extreme trials and savage raids, can be predicated on all players in a party understanding their roles and working in concert to resolve mechanics. The difficulty is exacerbated by Final Fantasy's official ban on third-party add-ons. Players can't rely on an add-on for predictions on what mechanic is coming next, or even how to resolve the current one. Instead, bosses and enemies have visible cast bars as part of the UI, and part of the challenge of these encounters is learning spell names, or boss actions and how to react to various spells. I actually really like this. It's crazy how much I rely on add-ons in The Elder Scrolls Online to keep me informed of mechanics and how much of a crutch it is. It's a much more organic experience without it. Extreme and Savage content especially can be very challenging, more so due to their myriad mechanics and AoEs, rather than DPS checks or excessive boss damage. And without any outside assistance, you are fully responsible for success or failure. I will note that this challenge is also somewhat enhanced, in a manner of speaking, if you have relatively high ping to the server you play on. I'm not exactly close to Final Fantasy's North American servers, and I have had a pretty rough time in harder content because of it. Whereas, I've had no similar trouble with ESO. I mentioned in the previous section that combat in Final Fantasy feels very slow, and I'm going to add here that the lethargy of this combat would be a heavily detracting factor if Final Fantasy's content was like ESO's. However, Final Fantasy's combat is very suited for its content. Bosses are very active in Final Fantasy. They're almost always casting some sort of spell or casting an AoE, something which requires players to react. Downtime between global cooldown presses is filled with boss activity, which requires and leads to player activity. This keeps the combat interesting. There's more to it than just pressing buttons on a GCD. There's all the mechanics, memorization, and reactions I just mentioned. By itself, Final Fantasy's combat and content is solid, as is ESO's, but we've only talked about half the package so far. Environment is the catch-all word I'm using to describe the visuals, audio, music, and world environments of The Elder Scrolls Online and Final Fantasy XIV. Subpar combat encounters can be carried on the back of spectacle, and already stellar fights can be elevated beyond belief through one thing alone:
Presentation!
Let's talk about visuals first, as they're the most obvious aspect of both games' environments. It's important to note that both of these games are sadly limited by the technology of their time. I'm mostly joking, but Final Fantasy was re-released in 2013, and ESO only came out in 2014, and both games are lacking the hyper-realistic graphics features that you'd expect from a more modern video game. In spite of this, the designers of both of these MMOs have created absolutely gorgeous environments with the tools they did have at their disposal. I'm a sucker for beautiful vistas, landscapes, and vibrant colors more than I am for the RTX on meme level of graphical fidelity, and I'm not disappointed by that aspect by either game. They're solid enough to be really immersive. ESO's visuals are a step up from Skyrim. While textures can be a little fuzzy if you look too close, the designers have crafted some absolutely gorgeous environments, which are a pleasure to run around in. That said, a lot of the zones in ESO are drab with muted colors. There's not a lot of vibrancy outside of a couple of zones, though I suppose that is a sad consequence of setting a game in the relatively grounded and muted world of Tamriel. Even if graphics aren't the highest fidelity, graphical spectacle is still present in both games, especially in Final Fantasy. ESO is somewhat hindered in this department by the grounded style I just mentioned, so its visuals can't get that interesting, but ESO's devs do a decent job of maintaining visual engagement. For example, the Sunspire Trial final boss's execute phase effect on the sky. Pretty neat. On the other hand, Final Fantasy is not similarly hindered, and its devs understand spectacle on a level that ESO's just don't. There's so many instances of jaw-dropping visuals in cutscenes, during content, and in world environments. I am struggling to pick which ones to show here as examples. Final Fantasy's designers are able to leverage the setting and world to keep blowing players' minds in ways which do not cheapen, but enhance the player experience. One thing I think which enhances Final Fantasy's world visuals especially is the ability to fly on mounts. Not only does this enhance player freedom, it also enhances the visual experience. Whereas up close, you will be able to see somewhat dated textures. From 100 meters in the sky, all you see is a stunning landscape, the bigger picture of the world, and the beauty inside it. In this respect, sadly, ESO players are just as grounded as the world they play in. Of course, visuals are only one half of a game's presentation. Audio makes up the other half, both sound effects and music. ESO's background music is solid and does its job. It's very reminiscent of Skyrim's music, so if you like that, you will like this. That said, in my opinion, the job of the background music in ESO is just that, to fill the background, rather than to take center stage. It exists, and I can't really say it's bad, but there's nothing which jumps out in my memory as a truly great song. something I can remember, like we all do the main theme of Skyrim. Final Fantasy's soundtrack, however, is fucking legendary. There's no other way to put it. Final Fantasy's bosses are typically not voiced, and sound effects are relatively muted. This means that the vast majority of a player's auditory focus can be on the music, rather than listening to sound effects or a boss's in-fight dialogue. This gives the composers room to create music designed to be the player's entire auditory focus, and they have taken full advantage of that. Final Fantasy's music is not solely comprised of orchestral scores. While some of the game's most haunting or inspiring tracks are, a lot of the game's OST is from many other genres, ranging from jazz to heavy metal. Music is such an integral part of the Final Fantasy XIV experience. You will be remembering a fight's music more than its mechanics long after it's over. Music can have a profound effect on a player's emotions, and the composers and game designers have worked in concert on this. When you're fighting the boss of an expansion, the music will swell, making you feel as legendary as your in-game player character is to the NPCs of Eorzea. Music can also shift with encounter phase changes, completing the trifecta of mechanics, visual, and auditory progress indicators. When the game is at an emotional climax, the music will help stimulate the feeling that the designers want you to feel. There's one song that I have a Pavlovian emotional response to because of how it was used, how integral it was, how inextricably tied in my fucking head it is to an incredibly emotional cutscene in Heaven's Ward. Every time I hear it, I tear up because all those emotions come rushing back. Even in more peaceful scenarios, the music is fantastic. Each of the major cities has background music for day and night, which package the theme of each city into a musical track. One of my favorite tracks like this is the Ul'dah night theme, called Sultana Dreaming. A muted melody of piano chords over a string ensemble marks the transition from day to night in such a beautiful manner. It's transcendent. Many of the songs from the Final Fantasy original soundtrack are on YouTube and have received many millions of views apiece. If you want to, my personal recommendations on 3 songs relatively free of spoilers you should check out are the Twinning theme, Shiva's theme, and Lakshmi's theme. Many of the most epic moments in the story have incredible songs attached to them, but I'm not going to recommend you experience those split from those moments. These YouTube videos also have footage of the fights and the like. The songs capping off Heaven's Ward and Shadowbringers are probably some of the best pieces of music ever created, but you would be doing yourself a massive disservice to experience them apart from the story context, the visual spectacle, and the mechanics, which Final Fantasy XIV synergizes so incredibly well. Both ESO and Final Fantasy have integrated content and combat quite solidly, so their presentations alone do not need to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining player investment. In most scenarios, ESO's environment does enhance combat and provide more than basic visual information, but not by much. There are a couple wow moments, but nothing about the visuals or audio sticks inextricably in a player's mind, like the rush of combat itself will. Final Fantasy is the opposite. The encounter's mechanics aren't what I remember most vividly. It's the visuals, the environments, and the fucking music. If you've made it this far, I've only got one thing to say.
Resilient souls, I salute you!
I'd also wager that you've enjoyed the video, so I'll just throw it out there that the like and subscription buttons exist. No pressure, but each time the numbers get bigger, my brain releases a little more happy chemical. Thanks if you've decided to do so, but regardless, let's get back to the video. I've never been incredibly invested in the PvP of either Final Fantasy or ESO, but I've played them enough to know what I like and also what I don't like. Final Fantasy's PvP suffers from two things: PvE-focused combat and terribly balanced PvP skills. Combat in Final Fantasy is designed around its PvE encounters, and it shows. Now, the slowness of PvE combat in Final Fantasy works in PvE because of how much activity comes from the bosses. Downtime between GCD casts is punctuated with AoEs to dodge, or mechanics to resolve, in addition to thinking about the next step in a rotation. It works together as a complete package. But when you take the mechanics and the AoEs out of the encounter, all you're left with is a slow and boring DPS rotation. There's no quick dodging and even fewer off GCD abilities to punctuate combat. Speaking of abilities, players going into PvP instances are given a new set of PvP-specific class spells, and all players are scaled so that everyone's on an equal footing, regardless of gear or level outside the instance. This would be great for balance if these skills weren't balanced terribly. It's incredibly difficult to score another kill on a player 1v1 with the skills that players are given in PvP encounters. They just don't output enough damage. Pair that with tank damage resistance buffs, the 3 rechargeable healing potions that everyone gets, God forbid a healer comes along, you're in for an incredibly boring time. In Frontline, the 24 vs 24 vs 24 mode, you'll most likely see death balls of players roaming around, zerging small packs around objectives. In the 4v4 mode, there's even a match-wide damage resistance reduction, which kicks in after about 90 seconds if nobody's died. Perhaps the devs intended Final Fantasy's PvP to be this way, or I'm terrible and I'm completely missing the point, but as far as I can tell, it sucks. And judging by my queue time for Feast, I'd say I'm not the only one with that opinion.
Liar!
On the other hand, I've been having a blast with ESO's PvP. The fast-paced combat lends itself extremely well to PvP. It honestly feels like playing multiplayer in a first-person shooter, with customization ramped up to 100, and that's a compliment. Players under level 50 are relegated to special instances, and have their level-based damage output normalized against each other. However, that's the only thing which has changed, even for the over 50 PvP. Gear, ability choices, skill morphs, essentially everything else is left up to player choice, which I absolutely love. Skills which you wouldn't take a second look at when piecing together a PvE build can be incredibly valuable against other players, and the same goes for gear as well. This can be a downside if you just want to hit the find match button and go, but if you like the customization and the preparation side, and seeing the effects of your choices, you'll love this. You'll likely also have a good time even if you don't like this, because the PvP is great on its own merits. In direct contrast to Final Fantasy, ESO's PvP is fast and engaging. The game's PvE mechanics translate incredibly well to a competitive environment. The 1 second cooldown for spells and off GCD movement abilities like roll dodging help massively in keeping the PvP engaging and fun. Aware and skillful players will be able to react quickly to a variety of scenarios thanks to this. The break free mechanic, where players can free themselves from stuns, roots, other forms of crowd control, does cheapen those crowd control abilities quite a bit, but it does give people another thing they can do to keep combat fast. Speaking of, combat encounters are usually resolved very quickly, in a couple seconds or so, which keeps the cadence of combat high. Characters geared for tanking can be a total nightmare to kill, but that's because of choices they've made to beef up. Player skills are doing significant damage. Battlegrounds map design also deserves a nod. Arenas have typically multiple avenues of approach and some have multiple levels. There's usually always a way to get the jump on someone, or get jumped yourself, even if you're not using stealth abilities. If Battlegrounds map design is good, Cyrodiil's map design is legendary. It's the largest zone in the game, and is an open-world PvP-enabled map, with several hundred players able to enter on each of the 3 factions' sides, and fight over territory, landmarks, fortresses, and stuff like that. In addition to this, Cyrodiil has all the hallmarks of a normal ESO world, like resource gathering and world content, with the added danger of the possibility of getting ganked by another player. I didn't spend too much time in Cyrodiil personally, but I will say that I'm planning on giving it another shot very soon. ESO's PvP may feel a little unfair sometimes, but its high tempo, rewarding combat, and depth of customization blows Final Fantasy's dull and homogeneous PvP out of the fucking water. Can a game really be called an MMORPG without some form of crafting system? Lucky for us, both games have some sort of crafting and gathering system, and thusly they get to keep their MMORPG title, but it's kinda obvious when it's put in with love and care, and when it's put in with the need to check off a box. How's that for a segue? ESO's crafting and gathering system is functional, but bare bones. To gather, you run around looking for resource nodes, and then hit E on them to collect. That's the gathering system, and crafting is essentially the same. The crafting system requires you to level up skills by crafting, to unlock higher level recipes, allowing you to press E on higher quality items. One thing that does keep it from being completely mundane is the existence of the set crafting stations put in the world, where you can craft some actually useful gear sets. You can also collect items which will allow you to craft in the various styles of the Elder Scrolls universe, and you can craft furniture items, which is really neat. In short, ESO crafting has some neat elements, but it's pretty boring overall, especially when compared to the crafting in Final Fantasy. No game I can remember playing has a more involved crafting and gathering system than Final Fantasy XIV. I've seen people saying it's good enough to be its own fully fledged game, and while I don't necessarily agree, I do see where they're coming from. First off, crafting and gathering are the focus of a whole set of jobs, with their own gear sets, skills, and everything else that the combat classes have. There's 3 unique gatherer classes, and while 2 aren't really anything special, the Fisher class is actually quite fun to play, and can have a bit of depth. The crafter classes are just as deep, with multi-level recipes, various resources to manage, and just as many skills as the battle jobs. Crafting high-tier gear and consumables successfully in high quality does actually require a bit of skill, and less stressful crafts can be automated, more or less at least, with the game's own macro system. It's pretty neat overall, and the latest craftable gear is only 20 item levels less than the best in slot, meaning it's a pretty good starting point for fresh level 80 jobs. It can also be upgraded another 10 item levels. You can also craft furniture for use or sale, just like in ESO. To summarize overall, ESO's crafting is functional, but Final Fantasy's is fan-fucking-tastic. Without other people, MMORPGs would just be RPGs, single-player games devoid of any social interaction, just like our normal daily lives. The social aspect of modern MMOs isn't as unique as it was back in the day, but for some people it is still quite the draw. And I gotta say, Final Fantasy's social sphere is something that I never thought I'd see in a video game. And I gotta be honest, this section's basically just gonna be me gushing about it. First off, the community's very welcoming, friendly, and just all around wholesome. It's really refreshing, honestly. Everyone's having a great time, and that fun shines through with their behavior towards other players. There's very little consequence for failing an encounter. Just respawn and try again. I honestly think design choices like this are as big a factor in how pleasant people are in Final Fantasy as the draconian conduct rules the game also has. While it's hard to justify actively being a meaniehead, the rules governing player behavior are quite strict. Honestly, a little ridiculous. Players can be penalized for calling a party member stupid, insulting their glamour, or simply stating you are bad at something. That said, one or the other, or both of these things, are working in concert to keep the community very friendly. I've literally never seen anyone get flamed, or flame another person. It's a pleasant change from the toxicity I've experienced and sadly been a part of in certain other games. I'm not gonna go as far as to say that Final Fantasy will make you a better person, but I will say that I've yet to meet any overtly bad people. Of course, I can't talk about the social aspect of Final Fantasy without mentioning the RP scene. I chose the Crystal Data Center at random, and only later learned that it's the NA RP hotspot, especially the Balmung world. And oh my god, it is a hotspot. Any given night, it's not uncommon to see 40 to 50 ads for player-run dance clubs, bars, and other RP events hosted at various player or guild houses across the data center. I held out for a while, but I eventually gave in and went to a couple events just because they were so prevalent, and I did not regret it one bit. Some of these use in-game music, some expect you to tune into a DJ's Twitch stream or something like that, but my personal favorites are those which feature bards using the in-game music performance system. There's a small bar on my homeworld that I like going to occasionally, just to listen to the bard performing old rock songs I grew up listening to. If that's not your speed, there's nightclubs, other forms of RP, some of it quite personal, if you catch my drift. I've even been to an in-game food festival with hundreds of people in attendance. I know I say unique a lot, but that's honestly the best descriptor of RP in Final Fantasy. I've never experienced anything like this. There's so many people who are so invested in RP that they make it an amazing experience for everyone, regardless of the level of your personal investment. Final Fantasy has so many emotes, dances, glamours, means of expressing oneself through a character that it's not hard to see why RP is so popular. Final Fantasy is so suited for it. I think one of the biggest things contributing to RP's popularity, honestly, is the housing system. For contrast, in ESO, houses are instanced. If I run up to the door of my main house in ESO, I only have to wait a couple seconds to see someone I've never met run out the same door, because it's his main house too. In Final Fantasy, however, there is no such confusion. Player adverts for an RP event will list a ward and a plot number for their event, because that's their house, and nobody else's. It may seem like a little thing, but it adds so much to the immersion. This does mean that houses are limited in number, and acquiring them is a pain in the ass, but that's a discussion for another video. ESO does get some points in this category too, but for a different reason. Most MMOs I've played expect you to join a single guild with who you'll do everything. ESO flips this on its head by allowing players to join up to 5 different guilds. This leads quite nicely into guild specialization. Guilds which focus on endgame raiding aren't compelled to invest time and money into securing guild assets like a trader, because their members who want to trade don't have to choose between their raiding guild and one with a guild trader. Your guild only raids twice a week, no problem. Join one who raids on another 3 days. Come home to raid nights every weekday. You can dip your toes into hardcore PvP by joining a Cyrodiil PvP guild, without sacrificing your roots in your PvE guilds. I'm a huge fan of this, and I think more games should allow this. It doesn't cheapen the personal relationships that you can form just because you're in multiple guilds. It's all dependent on how you spend your time, and it always has been. If you want to spend your time RPing in ESO, I'm sure you technically can, but I've only ever encountered one group of RPers in my several hundreds of hours, and I'm not really sure there is an established scene. I've never heard of one, anyways. That's pretty much it. Enough of discussing fun things. Now I have to talk about something I wish I did not have to. It's time to talk about
Money!
On the surface, both games are identically monetized. Both require an upfront fee for the base game, roughly about $20. Both have some sort of subscription fee, $15 a month, and both have paid expansions for $40. And both have non-cosmetic only cash shops. However, that is where the similarities end. ESO's monetization is much more aggressive than Final Fantasy's. I'm going to show you images of what you log into in both games, and I'm challenging you to spot the difference between them. Granted, that gigantic billboard isn't completely devoted to shilling microtransactions, as it does sometimes inform you about in-game events, but it's still an obvious reminder that ZeniMax Media is a for-profit company who would just be tickled pink if you checked out their latest store sale. ESO's in-game crown store sells everything from mounts, character skins, to in-game houses, EXP scrolls and skill points, to fucking loot boxes. 2021. They added a way to grind for some of the more expensive items, but doing so isn't feasible unless you play for several months. And in my opinion, it was just added so they have some defense, if officially pressed on the loot box issue by like a regulator or a lawmaker or something. Outside of the cash shop, the subscription I mentioned earlier is technically optional, but the way it's pushed at you, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's not. There's a metric ton of DLCs in ESO, each costing a decent chunk of crowns if you purchase them separately. ESO Plus grants you access to all of them, except the most recent ones, which you're expected to purchase separately. That doesn't grant you complete access to them though. I bought the Blackwood expansion when it came out, and when returning to the game to gather footage for this video, I assumed I'd have access to all the content taking place in Blackwood, considering I spent $40 on it. Unfortunately, no. You're also incentivized to go with ESO Plus if you ever plan on interacting with any sort of crafting bench, due to the crafting bag it gives you. I would be remiss if I didn't say it does give you a bunch of content for a standard subscription fee which you would expect to pay in other MMOs. In short, if you plan on playing ESO to a decent degree, plan on paying the $15 a month. It'll give you a bunch of DLC content and perks. Going back to the cash shops, Square Enix's cash shop is not much better, frankly, but there are a couple alleviating factors because of how Square Enix has approached monetization as a whole, meaning I won't be bitching for the entirety of this section. Let's talk about the cash shop and go back to those screenshots I showed. Final Fantasy's cash shop isn't anywhere to be seen, and that's because it's not even in the game. It's on an external website. This cash shop sells you everything from cosmetics and pets to character appearance changing potions to individual class level boosts and story skips. These skips cost up to $25 each and allow you to instantly skip an expansion's story quests or level a job up to 10 below the level cap, which is 70 currently. With how many jobs Final Fantasy has, it's hard not to be tempted to shell out some extra cash here, or for some of the other services it offers. The rest of Final Fantasy's monetization is much more consumer friendly, which is why I'm letting the cash shop slide for the most part. Unlike ESO, the sub is mandatory, but the base version of the game includes the first month of subscription. It's $15 a month afterwards. However, this purchase includes the base game and the first of 3 massive expansions, Heavensward. If you decide you like the game, and you want to continue into the next 2, you're only on the hook for purchasing the most recent expansion, Shadowbringers. You get the other one for free. If you decide to wait until Endwalker and you buy that, you'll get all the game's other content for free. Here's the kicker. There's a free trial which includes the base game and Heavensward with no time limit and only a couple limited features turned off for anti-botting purposes. That's several hundred hours of content for free, with essentially the same experience as a paying player. Pretty cool. In summary, both games have their predatory cash shops, but Final Fantasy's free trial and consumer-friendly expansion selling redeems it basically completely. ESO's a harder package to justify in terms of monetization, but it is still possible to do so.
Dungeon Master.
Whether you just want to have a cool mount for its own sake, or you want to flex on all those fucking plebs who just aren't quite as cool as you are, collecting titles, mounts, houses, pets, trinkets, and everything else like that is the real endgame of any modern MMO. It's what you pursue when you've completed a game's content, or it's the reward for completing it in the first place. ESO and Final Fantasy have different philosophies when it comes to player rewards and collectibles. Starting off with Final Fantasy. After a couple hundred hours of play, you will be drowning in collectibles, especially titles. By the time you complete the main story, it feels like you'll have had 100 or more titles thrown at you, each of which indicates that you've been able to complete story quests, a truly monumental feat.
Wow!
The game doesn't hold back with other stuff either. You'll accumulate some minions, dances, and a few mounts from doing main story content, and a lot of others will be easily obtainable from content loot drops, side quests, etc. Many of the coolest obtainable mounts are dropped from the extreme versions of trials. Mounts dropped by RNG, though players do earn tokens for a successful clear, 99 of which can be exchanged for the mount. It may seem like a ridiculous amount, but it does always give you that light at the end of the tunnel. Players collecting each of the trial mounts from an expansion earn a special mount as a reward. These mounts are great on their own, but the ability to run content from past expansions unsynced to that level does cheapen their prestige value quite a bit if you're not flexing the mounts from the most recent patch. There's no way to know if someone riding the Firebird mount, like I am here, was around back in Heavensward to run each of the trials when they first came out, or if they're like me and ran them unsynced. Final Fantasy does offer prestigious rewards for players looking to show off their skills with exclusive drip in the form of the weapon rewards from the Ultimate content. These Ultimates are the hardest content in the game, and cannot be run unsynced. The rewards for completing this content will never lose their prestige value, and they look objectively fucking sick. Some titles will retain their prestige as well. I do like Final Fantasy's collectibles model. The game floods you in a deluge of creative, unique, and awesome collectibles, while still offering rewards for players aspiring to the reputation that completing the game's hardest content should bring. ESO, on the other hand, is much stingier with its rewards. Instead of a deluge, it's more of a drip feed of titles, pets, and trinkets. And no, I didn't forget to say mounts there. Titles, mementos, and pets are occasional rewards for completing quest lines, getting certain achievements, or completing other activities. Titles are frequently rewarded for completing the game's harder dungeons on Veteran, as well as for both normal and Veteran versions of Trials. ESO doesn't have a level 6 system, which means that its achievements and their associated rewards will never be cheapened. I do have to give some credit for the genius idea of rewarding players with busts and trophies for completing content that players can go ahead and place in their houses. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of other rewards to pursue in ESO from a collector's standpoint, especially on the mount angle, which is what I'm personally most concerned with. Two notable exceptions are the Sunspire mount and the Ebon Dwarven Wolf. The Sunspire mount requires completion of every achievement in the Sunspire trial, including a flawless speedrun of the trial on hard mode for each of the bosses. This is somewhat difficult. The Wolf, on the other hand, is one I've been able to acquire, as it's less of a proof of skill and more of a proof of determination. Players have to farm 12.5 Antiquities leads or so, and then dig them up. It still is a really cool mount, especially when you consider that its only competition, outside of cash shop mounts, is mundane and dumpy looking horse mounts, purchasable from NPCs with gold. The prevalence of store mounts is probably my biggest problem with collectibles in ESO. Something like 95% of the game's mounts can only be acquired through loot boxes or direct purchases from the Crown Store. I don't know about you, but I don't really consider a mount a collectible when the only metric relevant to acquiring it is SPM, swipes per mount. It really fucking sucks. A lot of these mounts are neat and would fit very well into various trials or dungeons as completion rewards, but ZeniMax decided to milk their player base just a little bit more. At least players can collect pets, mementos, and titles through skill and achievement. ESO's approach to player rewards is really disappointing to me, especially when compared to Final Fantasy XIV, whose devs haven't let the existence of their store mounts affect their desire to drown their player base in the coolest shit they can think of. It'd be easy and probably popular, especially after those last two sections, for me to jump on the bandwagon here and proclaim Final Fantasy XIV as the second coming of Christ and indict ESO as Judas, backstabbing loyal Elder Scrolls fans with the dagger of predatory monetization practices. But while there is some truth to that conclusion, it's not the whole story. Both games have incredible aspects to them, but both games have their warts. ESO may lock most of its mounts behind an RNG paywall, but At least they don't sell level boosts like Final Fantasy does, right? Either way, there's a gargantuan amount of entertainment you can get from each game, at least several hundred hours worth. Fence-sitting bullshit aside, I am going to recommend you a basic course of action here, if you've come to this video looking for a general recommendation. First off, if you have friends playing either game that you know about, just play that game with them. Playing a game with friends makes it instantly better. You'll have a much better time just playing ESO or Final Fantasy with your friend group than you would by playing the other game by yourself. If this doesn't apply to your situation, I'd start off by taking advantage of the Final Fantasy XIV trial, which Square Enix has made available to everyone. It's a very generous opportunity to gauge how you personally enjoy the game, and you'd be remiss for not using it. If you don't enjoy your time in Final Fantasy, then try ESO's Standard Edition. The barrier to entry is only $20, and the content which comes with that purchase price should be enough for you to make a decision on whether you want to invest additional resources into the game. If you don't like ESO either, well, then you're fucked, because this video is only about those two games. There are caveats to these generalizations, of course. If you're only looking for a game to RP in, you're going to be delighted by Final Fantasy. If you're only looking to PvP in an MMO, ESO's the much better choice of the two. If all you care about is the story, Final Fantasy, etc., etc. If you are a super fan of either the Elder Scrolls or Final Fantasy franchises, and for some reason you haven't played their MMO entries, I have to recommend you go with the franchise you love. Both franchises have enough Easter eggs, tie-ins, and callbacks to titillate dedicated fans. Final Fantasy even has crossovers from games like Monster Hunter and Nier, and even Doom. As for me, I'm going to be revisiting both games as new content releases for them. If you see me in either game, feel free to say hello. Endwalker, the next expansion for Final Fantasy, is dropping early December, and I'm going to be playing it to the fullest when it does. Until we meet again, this has been Johnny Boy. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.